Well, this was one of those weeks in which I thought I was going one direction with the sermon, and so you see the title, Honor, Pride, and the Quest for Shalom. We are still working with Esther, but actually as things were coming together last night and I was going over notes and things, the sermon today actually will be Esther's explanation. So we're going in a little bit different direction. So if I don't speak quite as much about pride and honor, that's why, because I'm going a little bit different direction. But let's join together in a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this story of your faithfulness to your people. And Lord, I pray this morning that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart may be honorable in your sight. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, it was in March of 2003. I know it was in March of 2003 because it was shortly after our first son, Elam, was born on the 16th. We were watching TV and seeing all the rhetoric of demands that were being made and actions that were being taken. The U.S. government was demanding that the Iraqi government give over their weapons of mass destruction. And when they didn't do that, the U.S.-led coalition began its own destruction in Iraq. A preemptive strike to protect us from what could be if this wasn't done now. That summer, in July, Beth's family had a reunion down at St. Mary's, the Chivington family reunion. And by then, her grandma Chivington was remarried, and she brought Wayne along, the new husband, along to this. Wayne's a really great guy. He also is very set and staunch in believing that the U.S. is without fault, and especially the president at the time was without any fault. And he liked to talk about two things: the Ohio State Buckeyes and politics. Anytime you got together with him, you were going to talk about those two things. It didn't matter the time of year it was, you were going to talk about the Buckeyes. But that day he began talking about the war in Iraq. And he was talking, it was becoming obvious that he was feeling the need to support and defend the actions of our country. By that time, there's starting to be some questions about whether or not those weapons of mass destruction really existed or not. And so he said that at some point, these people who have questioned the reality of these weapons are going to have to apologize to the president when they find those weapons. And I just could not keep silent. Which brings us to our story for today of Esther. It was during the reign of Xerxes. The Jews were all in exile. And King Xerxes decided to throw a huge banquet for all of the nobles and the people of his kingdom. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? A couple weeks ago we talked about King Belshazzar and the banquet that he threw and how well that went for him. Well, King Xerxes threw this banquet and he allowed everyone to drink as much as they wanted. He told the stewards, let them have as much wine as they wanted. At the same time, his queen, Queen Vashti, was holding a banquet for all the women, the nobles' wives, in the palace. And after Xerxes was happy enough on wine, he decided that it was time to call in Queen Vashti. And so he sent one of the eunuchs to go and call her to come wearing her royal crown, that he might be able to show off her beauty to all the nobles that are there. But when the eunuch when he went to call upon Vashti, she refused to come. And the king was furious. He was furious and he didn't know quite what to do. He was so upset. And so he decided to talk with his officials, his experts in the law, to find out what it was that he should do about this. And they were very quick to say that this was going to bring more trouble. Because the word was going to get out that Queen Vashti had refused to come before the king when he called. And when the word gets out about that, all the other noble women throughout the country, throughout all these nations, will stand up and disrespect and dishonor the husbands of their households. And so it needs to happen, if it's in your honor to do this, is to send out a decree to all these nations and let them know that Vashti will never come before the king again. She will never be allowed to be queen and come before the king again. And then then the women will respect and honor their husbands because of that example that you've set. Now I can see by the women's faces that you're all very convinced that that's what causes you to respect your husband, is an order like that, right? Okay, maybe not so much. But the king thought it was a great idea. He thought it was a great idea, and so he sent out this decree to all the nations. But of course, before too long, after his anger subsided, he began to be a little lonely. And so he again went to his officials for advice, and they suggested that it was time now to go into all of the kingdom and to bring all of the eligible young women to come in to be a part of his harem. And of course the king liked that idea. So that's what he did. He went out. Sent his people out to bring in, his officials out, to bring in all the beautiful, young, eligible women in the kingdom. Now in the midst of all this, there was a Jew named Mordecai. He was among those exiled to this land, to the kingdom of Xerxes. He had been taken out of his home when King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon had invaded. And he also had a cousin named Esther. Now, Esther's mother and father had died, and so Mordecai, her cousin, had taken her on as his own daughter. And when the decree came out that all the young women were to come to the citadel to be a part of the king's harem, Esther was no exception. She was a beautiful young woman. And so she too went in to be a part of this harem. While she was there the whole time, Mordecai would come every day to try and find out how Esther was doing, what was going on, sharing his concern for her. And before too long, it was Esther's time to come before the king, because the king had a woman come before him each night. And if he could remember their name the next morning, then she could become the next queen. And Esther captured his attention. She captured his affection. And he placed his crown on her head, that she became the new queen. Queen Esther. In the midst of this, Mordecai, who was a servant who stayed by the gates, learned of a plot that two disgruntled guards had against the king, that they were deciding that they were going to try to execute the king. And when Mordecai heard this, he couldn't keep silent. He had to go and tell Esther what was about to happen. He went and told Esther what was going to happen, that the king was to be murdered. Esther took that news to the king and gave Mordecai the credit for it. And when they realized that the plot was true, they stopped it and executed these servants instead. Not long after that, one of the nobles, Haman, found the king's happiness as well and was put up to be the highest of the nobles, raised above everyone else, given honor, so much honor that everyone that he passed was to kneel down before him. Haman rather liked that. What he didn't like was that Mordecai didn't do it. And the other nobles asked Mordecai, "Why don't you bow down before Haman? Why don't you follow the laws of the land?" But Mordecai was a Jew, and he couldn't do that. He couldn't kneel down before Haman. And when these nobles asked Haman about to test him, to see if Mordecai was going to be able to get away with this outrage, Mordecai was enraged. And he decided not only to take care of Mordecai. Haman decided not only to take care of Mordecai, but to take care of all of the Jews as well. He went to the king and he told the king of these people who weren't living the way that they were supposed to. They weren't following the laws of the land. They were living off unto themselves. He advised the king that these people should not be let to live. And if it pleases the king, to send out an edict to all the land that on a certain day of the year, all the Jews should be killed. The king gave him his signet ring and told him to go and do that. And so the edict went out. It went out to all the land that all the Jews would be killed. on a certain day. Now when Mordecai heard this, he was incredibly distraught. He tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He went out into the streets, wailing loudly and bitterly. He could not keep silent the pain and the fear that he had of what was to come of the Jews. And when Esther learned that he was so distraught, she sent one of her eunuchs to go and find out what was wrong. And Mordecai shared a copy of the edict. He sent it back with the eunuch to tell Esther what was going on, to understand the danger to her people, and to instruct her to go before the king and to ask for mercy. When Esther received this, she was distraught too, but she sent a message back to Mordecai reminding him that the rules of the land say that no one may come before the king unless she is called, or she'll be put to death. And Esther hadn't been called for some 30 days. What was to think that she'd be going anytime soon? Mordecai replied, "Do not think that if you remain silent, that you will be kept safe within the citadel, or that your family will be kept safe. The Jews will be delivered, but perhaps you have been placed here for such a time as this." After receiving those words, Esther replied that Mordecai should go, and she and her attendants would all spend 3 days in prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting to discern what it was that she should do. And after those 3 days, she would go before the king, and if she perished, she perished. Mordecai went and did as he was instructed. After that time of prayer, Esther did go before the king. And the king did extend his scepter and allow her to come. He said, "Esther, what is it? Queen Esther, what is it that you want? I'll give you anything up to half the kingdom. What is your request?" But rather than ask for anything for herself, she simply made the request to the king that he and Haman would come to a dinner that she had prepared for them. So the king called on Haman. They went to this dinner, and again the king asked, "What is it that you want? What is your request? What is your petition? I'll give you up to half the kingdom." But Esther simply said, "If I have pleased the king, all I ask is that you come to another banquet tomorrow in which I'll tell you my request." Well, Haman left this first banquet feeling pretty good about himself. He went back towards his home, but on the way there, he saw Mordecai, and Mordecai once again did not kneel to him, which infuriated him. But he stuffed it down and he went home. He gathered his friends and family, and he bragged about his nobility. He bragged about his sons. He bragged about his wealth. But he also admitted that none of it means anything to him as long as Mordecai will not kneel to him. And his wife and friends suggested that it was time to take care of Mordecai, and that he should go to the king and ask for that to take place. Now apparently kings have difficulty sleeping at times, because that night the king wasn't able to sleep, and so one of his officials was reading to him out of the annals of the kings, the history of everything that happened during his kingship. Makes me think of a pastor who would listen to his own sermons in order to get drowsy and go at night. But as he listened to these stories of what had happened, they came to the story of Mordecai and how he had revealed this plot and saved the king's life. And the king said, "Now, what did we do to honor Mordecai for what he did?" "Well, Your Grace, we didn't do anything." "Well, who's in the court right now?" "Well, Haman has just showed up." "Well, bring him in." And when Haman came in, he asked him, "What would you do, what should I do as the king for someone that I want to honor?" Haman, of course, thought, who else in the kingdom would the king want to honor besides me? I mean, come on. So he came up with a great idea. If it pleases you, you should take the robes that you wear and place them on this one that you want to honor. You should take one of the steeds that you have ridden and allow him to ride on that. And you should have one of your nobles lead him throughout the city, declaring, this is what the king does for the one he wants to honor. Well, the king thought that was a pretty good idea. And he instructed Haman to go do that for Mordecai. Haman was the one who had to lead Mordecai through the streets, in the royal robes, on the royal horse, declaring, this is how the king honors someone. And it was after that that he came back for the second banquet with the king and with Esther. And once again, the king asked, what is it that you want? What is your request and what is your petition? Up to half the kingdom. He kept offering her half the kingdom. And finally, Esther said that her request is that her life would be spared, that her petition was that the life of her people would be spared. Because they are set to be destroyed and annihilated. And the king was taken aback. Who is it that has done this? Who is it that would suggest that you would be killed? And Esther exclaimed, an enemy, that vile Haman. At which point Haman knew the trouble that he was in. And the king stormed out of the room. And when he came back, Haman had a bag put over his face and was taken care of. The Jews were spared. The Jews were spared from what was going to happen to them because Mordecai and Esther could not keep silent. Which brings me back to that family picnic, the family reunion of the Chivingtons back in 2003. Wayne was talking about the war in Iraq. He was suggesting that those who questioned the existence of these weapons of mass destruction were going to have to apologize to the president once they were found. By this time, some 9,000 Iraqi civilians had died. 9,000, and there's no word about an apology for that. And so I couldn't help myself. I didn't want to create an argument or any tension in my in-laws' family. So I just simply said, when he said, when they're found, I simply replied, if. If they're found. Because there were a lot of questions about where these weapons were. I don't know that I really made that big of an impact on Wayne in saying that. But it seems to me that we have opportunities time and again in which we can speak for God's shalom. In which we can call into question people's perceptions, their understandings, their way of thinking about things. And that oftentimes it's not the grand efforts of an Esther or a Mordecai to save a whole people that are important. It's our heartfelt and perhaps winsome way of causing people to think or to question or wonder. It seems to me that this story of Esther models for us three ways that we are able to speak. To not remain silent. The first, of course, is with our words. With our words to share. Esther did not remain silent. She went before the king. Mordecai did not remain silent. In fact, the last sentence of the book of Esther in chapter 10 names that it was his speaking that saved the people. We can use our words. This last summer, when we were gathered at Kansas City, the delegates of Mennonite Church USA, we were talking about, one of the things we were talking about was a declaration or a statement, a resolution about the conflict in Israel-Palestine. A resolution that named some of the atrocities that have been happening, but also named the complexity of the situation there and the injustice that's going on. And as we talked together, it became obvious that we could not discern a clear statement of what to say. It became obvious that a lot of people didn't really know enough to feel like they could speak well into the situation. And so that resolution was tabled. But another resolution called to us in the next 2 years to study, to learn, to discuss together, that when we come back together in Orlando, we might be able to speak for peace, for justice in the midst of this conflict. And along with that was the list of resources that you see in your bulletin insert on the back of the reading that we did. Resources to help us in learning and talking about this. One of which is the video that the Peace and Justice Lunch has invited us to this afternoon. To bring a sack lunch downstairs and to watch the video with God on our side. And to talk about it and to think about what are the ways that we can speak. That we can not remain silent but speak for God's shalom. But there's other ways to speak than just with our words. Mordecai used his words, but he also used his actions. The simple act of not bowing down, not kneeling down to Haman, was a way of speaking out. It spoke volumes. You can tell by Haman's response. It spoke volumes. We too are able to speak out through our actions. When we serve on Wednesday up at our daily bread, we're speaking out for God's shalom. When we serve this month at the West Liberty Cares Food Pantry, we're speaking out for God's shalom. When we serve with Mennonite Disaster Service in areas of need, we're speaking out for God's shalom. And when we put together health kits and school kits for MCC, or when we make quilts or comforters for Adriel, we're speaking out for God's shalom. And when we mentor youth during our homework help program, we're speaking out through our actions for God's shalom. We speak out with our words, we speak out with our actions, we also speak out with our resources. The king expressed his thankfulness to Mordecai by demonstrating it with what he had, with one of his robes, with one of his horses, being paraded throughout Susa. We too speak out with our resources. Every Sunday when we give to the morning offering, we are speaking out in a tangible way for God's shalom. When we give money to the Iraqi student project or to Ahmed so that he can study at EMU to be able to be a person of peace in conflict situations, we are speaking out for God's shalom. But I can't help but think in the midst of these days in which we see on the news that 10.6 million Syrians have been displaced, and that the U.S. government has offered to take in 10,000 of those refugees next year. What it would look like for us to express God's shalom through using our resources to welcome people in, to care for them. What would it mean for us to open our families, our homes? What would it mean for us to repurpose the potter's place and to surround a family as a congregation to support? This last week I was at the Pastors of Excellence program out at Ashland Theological Seminary. It's a program in which when you're invited to come to, it's an opportunity to continue to grow in your own personhood and faith in Christ, to minister out of that. And part of it is to come there 4 times a year for these retreat times, multiple days in a row in which we get together in small groups and we discuss things together. I decided that rather than stay in a hotel, that I'd contact Pastor Matt Williams up at South Union and ask if he could connect me with someone to stay with while there. He did his seminary work at Ashland, and he still knows people there. And so he put me in contact with Pastor Keith, the pastor that he had worked with while he was in seminary. They didn't know me. They'd never met me. But they opened their home to me for that week. They fed me breakfast. They provided me a bathroom with a shower to be able to clean up, a bed to sleep in. Through their hospitality of their resources, of sharing that, they expressed God's shalom. In a world in which it's so hard to find safety at times, isn't it such a powerful statement to offer that to someone else? In the midst of the story of Esther, it seems to me that we experience this call of not remaining silent, whether it be with our words, with our actions, or with our resources. To be fair, I suppose it's a little bit strange to choose Esther for Shalom Sunday. I stopped before the end of the book. There's a lot that happens. A lot more death. A lot more destruction. But in the midst of that, it's interesting that the book of Esther never directly mentions God once. We still give him credit for it because obviously God was moving. But he also never affirms the action that the Jews took against the other people. But even more than that, what stands out to me is that in the midst of all this, the reason that they were there in the first place, as we've been reading through the Old Testament, through the prophets, through the kings, the reason they're there in the first place was because they weren't living in the God's shalom. They weren't following his ways in the first place. And so they were sent into exile. They had risen to power, they had their own authority, and they used it to harm others. And when they gained that power again, even in Susa, they still used it in that way. Some might ask if that still happens even yet today. As we were reflecting before we came in for the service, we meet in my office for prayer, and we were talking about the reality of how difficult it can be to talk about peace or shalom on a Sunday, in which, in the midst of our world, there's so much chaos and turmoil and conflict. But the reality is, shalom has not yet come, and that's the reason why we need to keep talking about it. That's the reason why we need to maintain that hope and that vision for what God desires for us. That we need to continue to look toward and work toward his kingdom shalom as we speak out with our words, with our actions, and with our resources. May God bless and guide us in doing this. Amen.